Hi, everyone. Welcome to Session 4, International Frameworks, Opportunities, and Barriers of the Hybrid Nature-Based Solution for Disaster and Climate Resilience Training course. Nature-based solutions, NBS, are increasingly recognized for their potential in addressing various environmental challenges, but are they the best way to manage climate and disaster risks? We will take a closer look at the opportunities and barriers when it comes to NBS in this session. In this session, we will first review the various international frameworks that recognize NBS as a part of critical strategies for addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, and disaster risk reduction. We will then look at the barriers to implementing and scaling up NBS. We will end this session with the principles of nature-based solutions developed by IUCN and the Commission on Ecosystem Management. Let's get started. The concept of nature-based solutions, NBS, has evolved over time, building upon various traditional practices and scientific understandings of nature conservation and management. The term itself and the formalized concept are relatively recent developments in environmental policy and practice, becoming more prominent in international discourse over the last few decades. Starting from the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, a comprehensive international agreement focused on conserving biological diversity, using biological resources sustainably, and sharing the benefits derived from genetic resources fairly and equitably, adopted in 1992. Followed by the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation in 2002, NBS is not explicitly used in the text, but the principles and actions promoted by these earlier protocols and frameworks inherently support NBS. These solutions involve managing and conserving ecosystems, restoring degraded areas, and using natural resources, all of which contribute to biodiversity conservation and sustainable development. Over the years, NBS have increasingly been recognized as effective ways to address a range of environmental challenges, including those outlined in the HE Biodiversity Targets and the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The CBD's strategies and action plans, developed and updated by its parties, often incorporate NBS implicitly through their focus on ecosystem services, ecosystem restoration, and the integration of biodiversity into broader land use planning, water management, and climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. NBS are thus an integral part of the efforts to achieve the CBD's objectives and are increasingly highlighted in the national strategies and action plans of the parties to the convention. In 1994, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification specifically recognized the important services provided by ecosystems, especially in dryland ecosystems, for drought mitigation and the prevention of desertification. As the impacts of climate change became more apparent, the role of ecosystems in mitigating and adapting to these impacts was recognized. NBS started being seen as vital in efforts such as flood mitigation, storm protection, and carbon sequestration. With the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015, NBS was further endorsed and adopted. The emergence of NBS as a formal concept is a reflection of the increasing recognition of the inseparable links between human well-being, climate change, and the health of our natural environment. It represents a convergence of traditional ecological knowledge and modern scientific understanding, aligning conservation objectives with broader societal goals. NBS offers a way to harness natural processes for sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and climate adaptation and mitigation, while also contributing to biodiversity conservation and the well-being of people. And according to the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, a total of 122 new NDCs were submitted in 2021, representing 148 signatories to the Paris Agreement. Analysis shows that these new NDCs reveal enhanced ambition for nature-based solutions to climate change, with 84% of revised NDCs including the protection or restoration of ecosystems, or agroforestry, in their mitigation and/or adaptation plans, up from 78% in the first round. 96 countries include NBS in their adaptation plans, 45 countries in both adaptation and mitigation components, 3 countries in just their mitigation plans, and 3 elsewhere in the NDC. This is an increase from 78% of the first-round NDCs. Moreover, 41% of all revised NDCs, 50 countries, explicitly use the term nature-based solutions, and an additional 2 mentioned nature-based actions or interventions. No country in the first round of NDCs used the term. The use of the term is particularly welcomed, as NBS are clearly defined, with a global standard and clear guidelines on their integrity. The world's poorest nations include NBS the most in the adaptation components of their NDCs. Specifically, NBS are referred to in all of the 17 nations classified as low income by the World Bank, and all but 4 of the 40 nations classified as lower middle income. As was the case with the first round of NDCs, NBS appear more regularly than engineered interventions, both in general and across all income groups. Engineered actions are included in 69% of the 110 NDCs that address adaptation. Engineered actions are explicitly included in the adaptation aspect of 76 NDCs, of which all but 2, Montenegro and Oman, refer to nature-based solutions and/or hybrid measures. 93% of nations that address adaptation refer to hybrid actions, combining MBS and engineered approaches. The most popular of these are resilient water infrastructure and management, 67%, and climate-smart agriculture, CSA, 63%. Hybrid approaches were particularly prevalent in lower-income nations. All of the NDCs that address adaptation from low-income nations included at least one type of hybrid action. 97% of those from lower middle-income countries did the same. When it comes to disaster risk reduction, NBS are increasingly recognized as an effective means to address various aspects of disaster risk reduction and are closely aligned with the objectives of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030. The Sendai Framework is a global agreement aimed at substantially reducing disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods, and health, as well as in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities, and countries. Under the 4 priority areas of the Sendai Framework, MBS are specifically mentioned in all of them. Under Priority 1 of Understanding Risk, it was stated that ecosystems need to be incorporated into risk assessments. Under Priority 2 of Strengthening Disaster Risk Governance, the Sendai Framework is calling for the integration of NBS into DRR and development strategies. Under Priority 3 of Investing in Disaster Risk Reduction, we need to have sustainable use and management of ecosystems and to integrate disaster risk reduction into environmental and natural resources management approaches. And for Priority 4 of Enhanced Preparedness and Build Back Better, the Sendai Framework is calling for the integration of ecosystem restoration in post-disaster needs assessment and the use of green infrastructure for disaster control. Overview. The Paris Agreement is a landmark international treaty adopted in December 2015 at the 21st Conference of the Parties, COP21, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, in Paris, France. It entered into force on November 4, 2016, after being ratified by at least 55 countries, accounting for 55% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Key objectives. The central aim of the Paris Agreement is to strengthen the global response to climate change by limiting global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, while pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, enhancing adaptive capacity, resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change, aligning financial flows with pathways toward low greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient development. Core components of the agreement. Nationally determined contributions, NDCs. Each country outlines its climate action plans, known as NDCs, detailing efforts to reduce emissions and adapt to climate impacts. These plans are to be updated every 5 years, with each iteration representing a progression beyond the previous one. Transparency Framework. The agreement establishes a robust transparency and accountability system, requiring countries to report on their emissions and progress toward NDCs, facilitating mutual trust and confidence. Global Stocktake. Every 5 years, starting in 2023, a global assessment evaluates collective progress toward achieving the agreement's long-term goals, informing future actions. Climate Finance. Developed countries are expected to provide financial resources to assist developing nations in mitigation and adaptation efforts, aiming to mobilize $100 billion annually, with discussions ongoing to increase this target. Legal status and participation. The Paris Agreement is legally binding in its procedural commitments, such as submitting and updating NDCs and participating in the transparency framework. However, the specific targets set within each NDC are nationally determined and not legally enforceable under international law. As of February 2023, 195 UNFCCC members are parties to the agreement, demonstrating near-universal global commitment to addressing climate change. Significance. The Paris Agreement represents a pivotal shift in global climate governance, emphasizing a bottom-up approach where countries set their own targets, fostering inclusivity and flexibility. It serves as a framework for international cooperation, aiming to catalyze sustainable development and a transition to a low-carbon future. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are a universal call to action adopted by all United Nations member states in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. These 17 interconnected goals aim to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure peace and prosperity for all by 2030. UN's effort towards mainstreaming nature-based solutions, NBS. The United Nations is actively promoting nature-based solutions, NBS, as a central strategy to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. NBS involve protecting, conserving, restoring, and sustainably managing ecosystems to address societal challenges such as climate change, food and water security, disaster risk, and biodiversity loss, while simultaneously delivering benefits for human well-being and resilience. Integrating NBS into global development. The UN Environment Programme and other UN bodies are embedding NBS across multiple SDGs. For instance, NBS contribute to SDG 13, Climate Action, by reducing emissions and enhancing climate resilience. SDG 15, Life on Land, through ecosystem restoration and biodiversity conservation. SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation, via natural water filtration systems. SDG 11, Sustainable Cities and Communities, by integrating green infrastructure into urban planning. It is also realized that combining NBS with built infrastructure can influence up to 95% of all SDG targets. Institutional commitment and policy frameworks. In 2022, the UN Environment Assembly adopted a resolution providing the first multilaterally agreed definition of NBS, emphasizing its role in sustainable development. Additionally, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration 2021-2030 aims to restore degraded ecosystems globally, reinforcing NBS as a key approach to achieving the SDGs. Financing and implementation. The UN is mobilizing financial resources to scale up NBS. Currently, approximately $133 billion per year is invested in NBS, with public funds comprising 86% and private finance 14%. Efforts are underway to increase private sector participation and integrate NBS into national development plans and climate strategies. And in other recent international frameworks, ecosystem approaches are mentioned more specifically. For example, in the New Urban Agenda, a document endorsed by the United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Urban Development, also known as Habitat 3, provides a 20-year roadmap for sustainable urban development and represents a shared vision for cities of the future, envisages cities and human settlements that protect, conserve, restore, and promote their ecosystems, water, natural habitats, and biodiversity, minimize their environmental impact, and change to sustainable consumption and production patterns. And under the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration for 2021-2030, led by the Food and Agriculture Organization and United Nations Environment Programme, a call for action for the protection and revival of ecosystems all around the world, for the benefit of people and nature. It aims to halt the degradation of ecosystems and restore them to achieve global goals. Moreover, it emphasizes that every single ecosystem, from forests to farmlands, mountains to oceans, cities to wetlands, needs to be cared for and repaired. There are specific areas, some scaling up efforts to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide, and to raise awareness of the importance of successful ecosystem restoration. More integration of NBS into the broader context of sustainable development and climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies is expected. As the urgency to address climate and disaster risks increases, NBS offers a path that is not only ecologically sound, but also economically viable and socially inclusive. They provide a means to work with nature to build a more resilient future, harnessing the power of ecosystems to protect and sustain human communities and the natural world they depend on. Prosody. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF, is a landmark international agreement adopted on December 19, 2022, during the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties, COP15, to the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. Often referred to as the Paris Agreement for Nature, the GBF sets an ambitious global roadmap to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and to ensure humanity lives in harmony with nature by 2050. 2050 goals. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework has 4 long-term goals for 2050 related to the 2050 vision for biodiversity. Goal A, protect and restore, ecosystem integrity and expansion. Ensure that all ecosystems maintain or enhance their integrity, connectivity, and resilience, leading to a significant increase in the area of natural ecosystems by 2050. Halting species extinction. Prevent human-induced extinction of known threatened species, aiming to reduce the overall extinction rate and risk for all species by at least tenfold by 2050, and restore the abundance of native wild species to healthy and resilient levels. Preserving genetic diversity. Maintain the genetic diversity within populations of both wild and domesticated species, thereby safeguarding their adaptive potential for future environmental changes. Goal B, prosper with nature. By 2050, biodiversity will be utilized and managed sustainably, ensuring that nature's contributions to people, including ecosystem functions and services, are recognized, preserved, and enhanced. Ecosystem services currently in decline will be restored, thereby supporting the achievement of sustainable development for the benefit of present and future generations. Goal C, share benefits. Fairly by 2050, it envisions a world where the benefits derived from the use of genetic resources, including both monetary and non-monetary gains, are shared fairly and equitably. This encompasses benefits from digital sequence information, DSI, and traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. Such sharing is to be conducted in a manner that respects and involves indigenous peoples and local communities, ensuring that traditional knowledge is appropriately protected. This approach contributes to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, aligning with internationally agreed access and benefit sharing instruments. Goal D, invest and collaborate. By 2050, GBF aims to ensure that all countries, particularly developing nations, including least developed countries, LDCs, small island developing states, SIDS, and economies in transition, have equitable access to the necessary means for full implementation. This encompasses securing adequate financial resources, enhancing capacity building, fostering technical and scientific cooperation, and facilitating access to and transfer of technology. A critical objective is to progressively close the annual biodiversity finance gap, estimated at $700 billion, by aligning financial flows with the GBF and the 2050 vision for biodiversity. Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework contribution to nature to minimize disaster risk. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF, integrates disaster risk reduction, DRR, into its biodiversity conservation strategies, particularly through Targets 8 and 11. These targets emphasize the role of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches in enhancing resilience to climate change and minimizing disaster risks. Synergistic impact on disaster risk reduction. Together, Targets 8 and 11 of the GBF highlight the critical role of biodiversity in disaster risk management. By promoting ecosystem resilience and the sustainable use of natural resources, these targets can contribute to reducing vulnerability to disasters and enhancing adaptive capacities. Implementing these targets will support a holistic approach to DRR, where conserving nature directly contributes to safeguarding human communities. In summary, ecosystem management for resilience through NBS is embedded in many global frameworks and agreements relating to sustainable development. All the Rio Conventions, CBD, UNCCD, and UNFCCC promote ECO-DRR in national conservation and environmental management strategies, as well as in risk management plans and programs. Ecosystem-based adaptation and ECO-DRR are recognized as instruments for promoting the synergistic implementation of the Rio Conventions, including through the HE biodiversity targets, the UNCCD land degradation neutrality targets, and the Cancun adaptation framework. The joint focus on resilience and ecosystem-based approaches provides a common entry point for the coherent implementation of these international agendas, particularly biodiversity, climate change, DRR, and sustainable development. You can see the various ecosystem services and priorities, goals, and targets of the global frameworks are closely linked in the diagram. UNDRR 2020 Ecosystem-Based Disaster Risk Reduction, Implementing Nature-Based Solutions for Resilience, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, Bangkok, Thailand. Now, let's look at the IUCN Global Standard for NBS. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, developed the Global Standard for NBS in 2020 to provide a common understanding, definition, and criteria for what constitutes an effective nature-based solution. Launched in July 2020, the standard aims to ensure that any intervention labeled as an NBS meets certain criteria to maximize its potential to address societal challenges effectively and sustainably. The IUCN Global Standard for NBS is based on 8 criteria and associated indicators that provide a framework to design, verify, and scale up NBS. These criteria are intended to guide users in the consistent application and scaling up of solutions that harness the power of nature and to safeguard the integrity and biodiversity of ecosystems. The 8 criteria are: C1, the starting point is a societal challenge. C2, even if site-specific, we need to consider the larger-scale systems and risks, e.g., part of an ecosystem, such as a mangrove patch, could be well out of the target site, but may have upstream and downstream impacts on the NBS. Local communities may depend on a livelihood market in the city, etc. This is to ensure we take factors at play, at scale into account to enable longer-term durability and sustainability of the solution. C345, 3 pillars of sustainable definition. It is indeed unrealistic to think we will always have a win-win-win or triple bottom line outcome, straight up. And so, therefore, C6, trade-offs. Each time, decisions need to be made about what is used today and kept for tomorrow, which stakeholders gain and benefit, and who will get returns later. These decisions are context-specific each time, but we can ensure transparency and inclusive decision-making to derive these decisions. If not, there is a high risk of promoting even further inequity, marginalization. C7. We are implementing solutions under changing conditions. Ecosystems are dynamic and complex in themselves. Changes with climate change, theory of change is based on assumptions at the beginning, but factors can change. For e.g., a cyclone can impact the NBS site. How do we register these factors, be able to adapt the solution, respond to the change, in order to maintain the relevance and still have a return for investment at the end? C8, the aspirational criterion. Embedding and institutionalizing NBS through sectoral policy mainstreaming, integrating into regulatory and operational frameworks of companies, and grounding in community-based governance structures for durability. We cannot achieve the NBS ambition through a short-term, one-off project approach. We will have a dedicated session on the IUCN Global Standard next week when we meet in Bangkok during the in-person portion of the training course, where we will discuss in more detail the IUCN Global Standard and how you can apply that in your work. While nature-based solutions, NBS, offer a multitude of benefits for addressing environmental challenges, their implementation can face several barriers, ranging from the definition of terminologies to financing for NBS and the measuring of the impact of NBS activities. We will go through the barriers to NBS from 4 categories: technical barriers, institutional and planning, capacity and market, and finance. Under the technical barriers, starting from the definition of NBS and the lack of data and baseline environmental data to the dynamics of working with natural systems, it is inherently difficult to implement NBS and to track its performance. It is very challenging to quantify the many co-benefits of NBS, especially positive externalities such as human health and livelihood, food and energy security, and biodiversity. And due to the public goods characteristic of NBS, the non-excludability, such as when a forested park in a city improves air quality, all residents benefit from this improvement regardless of whether they contributed to the creation or maintenance of the park. Or the non-rivalry nature, such as a wetland that provides flood protection, serves this function for all nearby property owners simultaneously, making it difficult for the private sector to be engaged. Overcoming these technical barriers often requires investing in research and development, building technical capacity, and fostering knowledge exchange among practitioners, scientists, and policymakers. Developing best practices, guidelines, and tools for the design, implementation, and monitoring of NBS can also help to address these challenges. Institutional and planning barriers can present significant challenges to the deployment of NBS. These obstacles typically arise from established organizational and governance frameworks, as well as the methodologies employed in planning and policymaking. Commonly, conflicting governmental agendas, a limited grasp of NBS principles among key governmental actors, and the protracted timescales needed to realize the benefits of NBS contribute to these hurdles. Moreover, the effective implementation of NBS often demands large-scale application, which may extend across national borders and encompass various subnational jurisdictions, such as provinces and municipalities. This breadth of impact introduces regulatory and legal complexities that necessitate consistent and efficient coordination across different sectors, a practice that is frequently absent in many nations. Addressing these institutional and planning impediments calls for comprehensive reforms, including policy updates, organizational realignment, enhancement of institutional capacities, and the establishment of cohesive planning frameworks that acknowledge and give precedence to NBS. When it comes to the technical capacity to identify, implement, and maintain NBS approaches, we are faced again with a lack of knowledge and awareness, coupled with technical skills shortage, inadequate training and education, limited research and data, poor access to resources and tools, insufficient institutional capacity, and difficulty in deciding the implementation scale. Addressing these capacity barriers often involves targeted training programs, developing partnerships with academia, fostering community engagement, and building institutional frameworks that support the integration of NBS into mainstream practices. Financial barriers are among the most significant obstacles to implementing NBS. Issues such as initial expenses, high upfront costs for design, land, and establishment make NBS financially daunting, particularly for entities with limited budgets. Risk perception. The uncertain performance and durability of NBS may result in higher costs or financing difficulties, as they are often seen as riskier than conventional infrastructure. Delayed returns. The significant yet long-term and sometimes indirect returns from NBS can discourage investors seeking immediate profits. Undervalued benefits. The ecosystem services and biodiversity preservation provided by NBS are not always fully valued, complicating the financial rationale. Financing mechanism gap. Traditional funding models are not always adaptable to NBS, posing a challenge for financial institutions. Incentive shortfall. Insufficient economic incentives may hinder private investment in NBS. Project size issues. The scale of NBS may either be too small to draw substantial investment or too large and intricate for easy management. To overcome these financial barriers, innovative financing mechanisms are needed, such as green bonds, environmental impact bonds, revolving funds, and PES schemes. Additionally, the development of clear business models, economic incentives, and the integration of ecosystem service valuation into economic planning can support the financial viability of NBS. How to scale up NBS approaches. According to the Global Commission on Adaptation, there are 3 crucial steps needed to make this happen. First, enhancing policymakers' awareness of the economic benefits of ecosystems is crucial. Natural structures like mangroves are not only cost-effective alternatives to artificial breakwaters, costing as little as $0.01 per square foot for restoration, but also offer additional advantages such as boosting fisheries. Globally, the protection of mangroves is estimated to have net benefits of $1 trillion by 2030. However, tailored assessments are necessary to pinpoint the most effective NBS for each region. Incorporating the extensive ecological knowledge of local and indigenous populations can further optimize the effectiveness of these strategies, as seen in the Building with Nature initiative, which thrive through active community engagement. Second, embed nature-based solutions into climate adaptation planning. Integrating NBS into climate adaptation planning can yield significant benefits, particularly when applied at broad scales, such as entire landscapes or urban areas. Governments, with their policy-making power and coordination capabilities, are well positioned to implement NBS at these levels. Starting with NBS in the early stages of adaptation planning is essential. Climate change poses a serious risk to water resources, disrupting patterns and causing droughts and floods. Studies indicate that by preserving and rehabilitating upstream forests, urban water utilities can enhance water regulation and potentially save nearly $890 million annually on water treatment across major global cities. Third, encourage investment in nature-based solutions. To overcome the financial barriers to adopting nature-based solutions for climate adaptation, governments can play a crucial role by adjusting policies, subsidies, and public investments to favor these approaches. They can also create incentives for private sector financing. There's a significant amount of funding available from various governmental, private, and philanthropic sources that remains untapped due to a lack of awareness. Increasing knowledge about these funding opportunities, sharing successful financing models, and identifying unmet needs where donors and investors can contribute is key, a task that various organizations are actively pursuing. Equally important, we need to address stakeholder engagement, motivate community involvement through incentives, develop a targeted communication strategy with clear objectives to advocate for NBS, promote equity and justice, address the underlying factors of exclusion, inequality, and injustice throughout the implementation process. Consider trade-offs, be mindful of potential losses, and strive to prevent the unfair transfer of risks and expenses. Target vulnerable areas, give precedence to actions in locations and among communities most susceptible to risks. Implement valuation tools. Employ methods to evaluate the social and political impacts and ramifications of NBS. By addressing these areas, we can enhance the scale and impact of NBS, ensuring they contribute significantly to addressing global environmental challenges. Source: clonch/thecityfix.com/3-step scaling nature-based solutions climate adaptation Jonathan Cook. Success stories: Leipzig adopted tree. The three core dimensions of NBS: societal challenges, biodiversity net gain, and co-benefits for human well-being, are underpinned by the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. IUCN and its Commission on Ecosystem Management have outlined 8 principles that provide a framework for understanding and implementing nature-based solutions, NBS. These principles are designed to ensure that NBS effectively address societal challenges in a way that benefits both human well-being and biodiversity. The principles are: Principle 1. NBS is not an alternative to or a substitute for nature conservation, which remains an important global priority in its own right. While NBS embraces nature conservation, not all conservation actions necessarily qualify as NBS. NBS can be complementary to and benefit from nature conservation efforts across a landscape, e.g., when a protected area was established to conserve a certain species, but later contributes to an NBS intervention nearby. In some cases, NBS closely addresses biodiversity conservation priorities, but not invariably. Principle 2, e.g., technological and engineering solutions. NBS promotes the provision of a full range of ecosystem services, or can be complementary to other actions, such as a mixture of seawalls and mangroves protecting a coastline from ocean surge. Principle 3, NBS are evidence-based approaches built on a thorough understanding of particular ecosystems. However, evidence can come from various sources, including science, traditional knowledge, or a combination of the two. Because all situations are different, NBS should consider natural and cultural contexts that include traditional, local, and scientific knowledge through people living and having a stake in the ecosystem. In addition, this principle refers to the need for full participation in developing an NBS. Principle 4. NBS interventions for food and water security or disaster risk reduction frequently provide services for governments and communities distant from the site, but can entail loss of opportunities for those living in or near the service's source. It is important to ensure that different categories of stakeholders are involved in the NBS, that the NBS in place provides benefits to affected actors, from local communities to infrastructure managers, private sector, up to the national level, and ensure that loss of local opportunities is avoided. For example, when a community maintains a forested watershed to supply water downstream, fair and transparent processes, as well as an explicit understanding of the local politics of negotiations and implementations, are needed. This understanding should reflect the values of the watershed to the forest community and help determine the nature of compensation-based mechanisms for the supply of ecosystem services, such as through payment for ecosystem service schemes. Principle 5. NBS need to be developed and implemented in a manner that is consistent with the temporal dynamics and complexity of ecosystems in order to support biological and cultural diversity, so that the services provided by the ecosystem are sustainable and, as far as possible, resilient to future environmental change. Principle 6. Many NBS are implemented over large spatial scales, such as a watershed or a large forest, which usually combine several ecosystems, such as agricultural, inland waters, coastal, forest, which might in some cases be transboundary. This principle is linked to Principle 4 and Principle 8. Even when an NBS is implemented at a specific site level, which is linked to Principle 3, it is important to consider the wider landscape scale context and consequences, aiming at upscaling where appropriate. Principle 7. NBS should avoid changing or simplifying an ecosystem in favor of a particular service or resource, such as replacing natural mixed good land with a monoculture tree plantation. Instead, a thorough understanding of trade-offs between current and future benefits is important when deciding among different NBS activities. Understanding and providing a process for fair and transparent negotiation of trade-offs is essential for ensuring successful NBS. Landscapes may contain different stakeholder groups that use resources for their livelihood, which may result in complex and conflictual relationships that need to be identified and negotiated. Hence, the need for Principle 8 to support Principle 7 and the complexity of negotiating a trade-off. Principle 8. For NBS interventions to have a broad influence, it is important to make sure that they are not only practically undertaken in the field, but are also incorporated into policy and related actions. The implementation of this principle will support large-scale interventions, Principle 6, and it includes the potential for adaptive management, as the intervention's outcomes can inform and adapt natural resource management policy. These principles guide the design and implementation of NBS to ensure sustainability, cost effectiveness, and provision of multiple benefits to both society and the environment. The Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, also recognizes the importance of nature-based solutions, NBS, and while they don't have a distinct set of NBS principles separate from the IUCN or other environmental bodies, they emphasize several key principles in their work that align closely with the broader understanding of NBS. In 2022, SEI published the Principles for Just and Equitable Nature-Based Solutions Board. These are 5 principles to incorporate in NBS to ensure a just and equitable implementation. They include: 1. Ensure that design, governance, and implementation processes are inclusive and transparent. 2. Tackle root causes of marginalization, inequality, and injustice at all stages. 3. Limit the creation of economic and non-economic losses and avoid the unjust redistribution of risks and costs. 4. Prioritize interventions for the most at-risk places and communities. 5. Devise and use valuation and measurement tools that assess social and political change and consequences. While these principles are not uniquely SEI's, they reflect the Institute's focus on integrating environmental, developmental, and social considerations into its work on NBS and other environmental solutions. SEI's research and policy work often emphasize the importance of these principles in creating effective, equitable, and sustainable solutions to environmental challenges. Countries are increasingly integrating NBS into DRR. Philippines invested $22 million in mangrove restoration post-Typhoon Haiyan to protect coastlines, IUCN 2017. Switzerland allocates up to $150 million annually for forest management, 5 to 10 times cheaper than engineered structures, IUCN 2017. Japan expanded Sanriku Fuko Reconstruction Park, saving over $2.5 billion post-2011 tsunami, IUCN 2017. Summary: NBS are vital for addressing the escalating risks of disasters driven by climate change. They provide cost-effective, multifunctional solutions that enhance resilience while delivering environmental, social, and economic benefits. NBS offer a cost-effective approach to disaster risk reduction by harnessing natural processes to mitigate hazards and build resilience. Integrating NBS into DRR strategies will not only reduce vulnerability, but will also deliver multiple co-benefits for ecosystems and communities. As climate change and environmental degradation continue to intensify disaster risks, it is imperative to mainstream NBS into policies, planning, and practice, supported by strong evidence, capacity building, and cross-sectoral collaboration. Now we come to the end of Session 4. Thank you for your attention. We invite you to Session 5, which is the last one of the online part.